Hi guys, we're back with the last section of notes. We just have a little bit left to do talking about photosynthesis. Remember where we started talking about photons and how those photons carry energy from the sun. They strike the pigments located in the thylakoid. They use that energy to split water and to give that energy to NADP plus, making it into NADPH, and also ADP into ATP. It releases oxygen in the process. So those are all called the light-dependent reactions. But really the point of the light-dependent reactions is to create these two energetic molecules that will trigger carbon capture and making that carbon into sugar. This sugar then enters cellular respiration and powers all of the processes that keep that plant alive and functioning. So to wrap up photosynthesis today, we're going to talk about the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle are also known as the light independent reactions because they can actually function in the dark. As long as they have energetic molecules, ATP and NADPH, they can function without any light. One way to remember the difference between NAD and NADPH is that P, think of photosynthesis. Okay, so although these molecules are very, very similar and actually have a similar function in both of these processes, which is to carry electrons or to carry energy from one part to the other, it is important to remember that NAD and FAD work in cellular respiration and NADPH works in photosynthesis. Okay, so let's get to it. The second process of photosynthesis occurs in the stroma, so outside the thylakoid in the liquidy kind of matrix that surrounds those grana. The Calvin cycle is this process that builds sugar from CO2 that was taken in from the plant's environment. So this is in the form of a gas. That gas exchange happens in the stroma, or the stomata rather, on the underside of the leaves of the plant. Rubisco is a really important enzyme that you should know about because it is the enzyme that grabs carbon dioxide from the environment and enters it into the Calvin cycle. Rubisco is really important as far as evolution is concerned because some plants have Rubisco that is much more sensitive, and other plants, their Rubisco is not quite as sensitive. So there's actually different versions of this enzyme that have evolved over time, especially for plants that live in high altitudes where the air is thinner and doesn't contain as much CO2. So here we're going to focus on the second half of photosynthesis. Our reactant is CO2, ATP, and NADPH. Our product is going to be sugar, and then the reduced compounds NADP plus and ADP. So another important concept for linking evolution and photosynthesis is that plants require a huge amount of water in order to get the electrons necessary to fuel the Calvin cycle. So many plants have adapted to drier environments by either separating the light and dark reactions, where they do the light reactions during the day and the dark reactions at night, or they can open and close their stomata to prevent water vapor from escaping. So on hot, dry days, plants can do this, but they essentially could suffocate themselves if this goes for too long. It does, however, conserve water, but it prevents gas exchange. Okay, the closing of the stomata is especially important in certain plants that we call C4 or CAM plants, where they can actually adjust the sensitivity of their Rubisco or produce more Rubisco so that the times that their stomata are open, they can actually capture all the carbon necessary to be able to fuel those light independent reactions at dark. So some examples of these plants, crop plants, are really, really excellent at doing this, probably because humans have facilitated a little bit of unnatural selection, I guess you could say. So in sugarcane, they're an example of spatial separation. So they do carbon capture in the mesophyll cell, and then a second type of cell called a bundle sheath cell that's deeper inside the leaf will actually finish up the Calvin cycle and change that carbon into sugar. Another example here on the right is pineapple, which of course grows in a very tropical environments, that they will actually do carbon capture at night, which is the light independent reactions, and then actually use that carbon during the day to make it into sugar. So they don't need the energy to get the carbon. They just need the energy to build the carbon into sugar. So they separate those steps through evolution. They have evolved this ability, and it helps them to be very, very effective in water use and the building of sugar. So the other big idea in this last part of chapter 8 is this idea that chloroplasts and mitochondria have similar evolutionary backgrounds, and they actually act as if they're a cell within a cell. They also can generate ATP. We think of mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, and that is true that most of the ATP from that living things use comes from the mitochondria, but the chloroplasts also generate ATP so that they can transfer energy from the light reactions to the dark reactions. So they both utilize these electron carriers. They both are utilized for cycles, and they then regenerate the electron carriers to be used again. One other important thing that we haven't talked a whole lot about is this idea of a proton pump. So in Unit 1, we talked about the sodium-potassium pump in animals that helps create electrochemical gradients in muscle and nerve cells. Well, in plants, the same process of active transport of protons is used, but instead of creating electrochemical gradient, those protons pass back through down their concentration gradient, and the spinning of the ATP synthase molecule, because of the protons passing through, is actually what creates ATP. So we're changing it from chemical energy to mechanical energy, and then storing that mechanical energy as another form of chemical energy. So it's a little confusing, but your book does a really nice job showing how this proton, or these hydrogen ions, which are basically protons, are stored in the intermembrane space in mitochondria. And so then the protons will go from this intermembrane space to the stroma. So they're going deep in. And as they pass through this enzyme, it creates ATP. In the chloroplast, it's the same, just the exact opposite, that the protons are pumped into the thylakoid. And as they pass out, due to diffusion from high concentration to low concentration, they also create ATP molecules. So the big difference, of course, is that the mitochondria are making ATP to be used by the rest of the cell, but the chloroplast is just making a few ATPs to power the light-independent reactions. But in both cases, these hydrogens passing through are what creates that energy that can be then used by the cell. So keep in mind, like we started this chapter talking about, directly or indirectly, photosynthesis powers the entire world, powers and nourishes the whole world. The energy that powers life on Earth comes from the sun. It gets stored as chemical energy in glucose and other simple sugars. It enters the food chain, and that's where all living things eventually get their food and energy from. These organic molecules pass through the carbon cycle. They combine with other atoms and molecules to sustain life on Earth. Plants will also store excess sugar in a lot of the foods that we eat, especially crop foods. We are harvesting the leaves, the roots, the seeds, all of the stored energy that the plants made for us. We then use as either food sources or as fiber, to build our homes or to make cotton and clothes and those types of things. So lots of different plant parts are useful to us as humans. And don't forget, another really important byproduct of this process is, of course, oxygen. Most life on Earth requires oxygen. We are aerobic creatures, and we need that oxygen to metabolize our food. So here's a more detailed version of that same diagram. The one you really should commit to memory is the simpler one, the one that you have in your notes. But if you really wanted to dig into this process, if this is really interesting to you, just keep in mind that the reactants for the light reactions, light of course, and water is split. It energizes NADP plus and ADP into ATP, NADPH, and then oxygen is given off. The process is inside the light reactions, photosystem 2, electron transport chain, that's where we make the ATP, then photosystem 1, and then electron transport chain again to make the NADPH. Okay, that energy then will fuel the CO2 capture by Rubisco. It transfers energy to another intermediate that we call 3-phosphoglycerate, which then changes 3 carbons into G3P. And sometimes we go around again, and that will make sucrose or other 6-carbon sugars. So again, if you really want to dig in deep, your book goes into very fine detail about these individual steps within the steps. But the one that you should commit to memory is the simpler one that is found in your notes. Okay, so last little bit of chapter 8. To utilize light energy, plants perform photosynthesis. It's pretty complicated, but it follows a lot of the same basic pathways we saw in cellular respiration, including electron carriers, ATP and NADPH, the release of oxygen, and the capture of carbon using Rubisco. This is the way that all life on Earth captures energy so that they can perform the basic functions of life, and then it passes on to the food chain to fuel the entire living world.